Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. I hope you had a good weekend. And joining me on World War II TV tonight is Dan Kaszeta. Dan has been on before. He talked about chemical mortars and chemical weapons, but today he's here to take us to the Baltic and the Forest Brotherhood, which is the subject of his latest book. And links to purchasing Dan's books can be found in the description below. If you're new to the channel, welcome aboard. Don't forget, all the description contains everything you need down there. All the information you need is in the description, I should say. And if you would consider becoming a patron or a channel member, that would be greatly appreciated. And of course, thank my guests by going out and buying their books. Without further ado, I'll bring Dan in. Good evening, Dan. How are you today?
Good evening. Good evening, Paul. Great to be back.
Great to have you. So, chemical weapons, chemical mortars, and now we're off to the Baltic states. So I've got to ask, where did the interest in this part of the world and bringing it to an audience come from?
Well, it comes in my DNA. I'm half Lithuanian, actually. As you're going to see briefly, the front picture by the front cover of my book, there are partisans in my family tree. There are not direct ancestors, but rather a lot of my countrymen, got stuck between two other bigger countries and had a hard road to hoe. And some of them ended up taking the struggle to the forests. Some of them ended up taking the struggle to the gulag, and some never came back. So it's been my chemical warfare expertise is professional. This is personal.
And we just talked before going live about the difficulty of studying these areas where good guys, bad guys is a little bit less clear, and you're a small player, as you said there a minute ago, between massive players. How difficult is it to do the research? Because you must be having to be in multiple languages, multiple archives.
Yeah, it's not as bad as it used to be, partly because in Lithuania, excellent amounts of archival material were actually seized off of the Russians at the breakup of the Soviet Union. Similar in Latvia and Estonia, although somewhat less material has been made available. And actually also online translation is getting much better. You can shove a PDF into into an engine now and get a reasonable answer out of it. And also, these are areas where scholars in the Baltic states have been actually grappling with this aspect of their own history for the last 30 years now. It was formerly a verboten subject under the Soviet Union, but now we've had more than 30 years of independence, and this is a valuable part, and I'll explain why it's a valuable part of the story of three interesting countries that are suddenly all of a sudden in the news now because they're part of this. They're really on the coalface of NATO, and there are NATO allies, and all of a sudden we have a war and a heated, nasty land war in Europe again. So all of a sudden, the military history of this period, particularly bits that are still within living memory, are relevant. So
absolutely,
let's dive in.
Yep, you've come on with a PowerPoint. So, folks, we'll do the majority of questions at the end today. Unless there's something about a fact or data on a particular slide, we'll kind of save them for the end there and let Dan plow through with the presentation. But yeah, if you have anything that particularly relates to what we're talking about, we'll try and address it. But basically, I'm going to hand over to my guest to take us through this incredible story.
Okay, so this is called The Forest Brotherhood, and that's the name of my book. It's because in all three of the Baltic languages, Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian, the nickname for the anti-Soviet partisan groups became the Forest Brothers in all three languages. So it's a phrase that it resonates in all three of those countries. And I'm gonna just dive in here a little bit. First of all, just a refresher of what we're talking about. We're talking about Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They sit on the right-hand side, the eastern side of the Baltic Sea. It's only because of habit and modern sort of conventions in English language we don't also include Finland in this lot. Finland shares a lot of history with these three countries in a lot of ways. And it's a pet peeve of mine that they get co-opted by the Scandinavia as opposed to the Baltic countries, but that's a grievance for another day. These three countries get lumped together or ignored. They often don't get talked about separately and individually. There's a tremendous backstory to all three of these Baltic countries. I don't really want to take up a huge amount of time, but there's been other podcasts on that subject. If anybody's really, really interested in it, I'll be doing an entire one-day master course in the potted history of the of the Baltic states from prehistory to yesterday in the end of March in Gladstone's library in Howard in Wales, so you can come along to that. But just to give you a quick, real brush through, all of them had a medieval history. Lithuania had a pretty grandiose medieval history as a large grand duchy, only some of which was actually ethnically Lithuanian. Estonia and Latvia were very much early victims of colonialism, actually. Very much aggrandized, colonized by German crusading knights on the called the Livonian Order or the Knights of the Sword. And anyway, so what we have is three countries who had a medieval existence in some form or fashion, gradually got subsumed by their neighbors as more modern nation states evolved. By 1795, all of them had evaporated off to the map into Tsarist Russia. By 1918, though, at the end of the First World War, you get a new map of Europe, and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia are back on the map. Okay, as part of a whole panoply of new countries carved out of the wreckage of empire. So, and Poland gets on the map too. All right, so what you get is actually quite democratic constitutions set up and quite optimistic, the Estonians get to be Estonia for the first time, really, and have their Estonian language and have their own thing. Ditto the Latvians, and they aren't under German, colonialism. The Lithuanians get their old country back from the Middle Ages that they still remember and talk about. If there's a critique of these old constitutions, that they had too much democracy. It was extremely easy to form a political party. And in Latvia, for example, there were hundreds of political parties. So what you had was fractious elections and fragile coalitions. And you had a lot of optimism tempered by a lot of opportunism, and then of course you get the Great Depression coming along. So by the 1930s, all three of these countries, had backslid really into one-party rule or authoritarian rule that was quite similar to one-party rule. I mean, in Latvia, there wasn't even a party; it was the one guy. Okay. It's a mischaracterization to call them fascists, because actually none of them, they were basically one-man rule in all three countries. In all cases, basically trying to think that it was going to, maybe restore democracy eventually. All three of them felt that fascism was actually more of an internal threat than communism by this point. But then what happened? We have this thing called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which surprised the world and particularly surprised the Baltic countries. It was this peace agreement and active alliance between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And it's not going to end well for the countries stuck between the two. Now, what wasn't advertised at the time, there was this classified appendix that never saw the light of day for decades afterwards, but this classified protocol to the Hitler-Stalin Pact divided up Eastern Europe there. And what you see there on that slide is the dividing line. Okay. Now, up to this point, when the war starts basically 7 or 8 days after this pact is signed, and 17 days later, the Soviet Union enters the war on the side of Germany. It's very, very clear to anybody from this part of the world that the first 662 days of the war, the Soviet Union was on the same side as the Nazis. And we can't forget that in this particular story, because when you talk about dividing up countries, it was a collaboration between two large empires dividing stuff up again. It was just like 1795 when Austria, Prussia, and the Tsar of Russia divided up this part of the world. It was another salami slicing exercise. Now, these Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians didn't really know that they were being divided out of existence right away. They had hoped that they were going to lay low like say, the Nordic countries and let this sort of spin out on mainland Europe. You hope they could slide by in the whole thing. They started seeing bad signs when by the end of 1939, Finland, which is just off the top of my map, also divided up, gets invaded by the Soviet Union, and manages, because of several factors, defensible terrain, a harsh winter, a good army, and Marshal Mannerheim, manages to, not quite lose, but not quite win, fight the vastly superior Red Army to a standstill. But, there's optimism. There's hope that, nobody's going to bother us. We're not really on the road to anywhere. But things change, because by 1940, let's see what my next slide is. I'm losing the plot already. You're going to see here, from 1940 onward starts what I call the very bad Baltic sandwich. And it's a bad sandwich that starts in 1940 and doesn't end until 1991. Okay. And so those blue blocks there are sort of the phases of resistance that I'm going to talk about. And so what you get is in 1940, I'm going to skip slides a bit. In 1940, the Soviet Union takes over all three of the Baltic countries in a not quite an invasion, but there's a perfectly good German word for this, an Anschluss, just like happened in Austria, browbeaten out of existence, basically, because there was they knew they couldn't put up a fight. Their armies weren't very big. They'd already had Soviet military bases foisted on their soil. So all three countries basically are forced at gunpoint to vote themselves out of existence with mock elections. And that's what happens. And so the way I describe this, and it happened very quickly, and it happened in June of 1940. And now your keen listeners know what's going on in June of 1940. Hitler is promenading down the Champs-Élysées. Yeah. In June 1940, doughboys are squatties are getting on small boats in Dunkirk. The world is ending on the Western Front, as far as many people know. Bombs are starting to land on the UK mainland. So what a mess. And it's a point where most of the rest of the world is really tied up, and there's nobody going to help. Nobody's going to come to the aid of the Baltic states.
I'm just going to ask you, Dan, is there any kind of media interest? Are there any journalists or anybody? Because, we famously
it gets written up on sort of page 3 of the New York Times, not page 1. The fall of Western civilization, page 1. P.S. Baltic states, see page 27. No more. It's quite a shock, because there was rapid Sovietization and depression. If the way I put it is, if you were in Kaunas, Lithuania, and got knocked on the head in an accident on, say, the 25th of May, 1940, and you woke up a month later out of a coma and looked out the window, you were in a totally different world. There was a different flag flying. There was a different government there. The policemen wore different uniforms, and the newspapers you used to read didn't exist or were about to go out of existence, and people were starting to get hauled off to the gulag. Okay, and so you had this rapid oppression of the Baltic states. They were rapidly integrated into the Soviet Union. There was a lot of sort of top-down nationalization of the economy. And there was generally poor preparedness for the war that was going to come up in 1941. We're going to get to that. I'm going to go back one slide here. I probably put this in the wrong order. There are a lot of conditions, however, that made for the possibility of Baltic resistance.
Right.
Okay. And so people ask, well, why did resistance crop up here in ways that may not have cropped up elsewhere? And I'll go through these because these are important. One is national identity and language. These are countries who are just now getting comfortable in their own skin with their own passports, their own citizenship, their own school curriculums, their own history books, and all of a sudden that's being ripped away. Okay. There is a historical dislike of Russian occupiers and fighting the Russians going back many centuries. But there are also people this is 1940, there are many people alive who remember how bad it was under the Tsar, okay? Because it wasn't that long ago. Okay, so there's a lot there's a lot of dislike of Bolshevism because all three countries fought against the Bolsheviks in 1918 to get their independence. So there's a lot of anger and hostility already. Geographically, there's lots of forests and swamps. There's not really mountains and hills so much, but there are thick forests and thick swamps. So if you've ever wandered around some of the forests in sort of Lithuania and Latvia, you can. Yeah, this is not quite triple canopy jungle of Southeast Asia, but it's not far off. It can be as dark as night at midday in some of these forests. Lots of smallholder farms. This becomes very important. It's because small farmers are in a position to support partisan groups, right? Because at the end of the day, a guerrilla needs to eat. Okay. Yeah. In all three countries, there had been breakup of old landed estates to various events. We could do extremely pedantic discussion of land reform in the Baltic states, but we'll save that for another day. Because of the First World War, where rather a lot of Baltic people had been conscripted into the Tsarist military, there were a lot of military veterans. There were veterans of their wars of independence, but also at various points, there had been conscription during the interwar period. So even though the armies were small, rather a significant portion of the population had served in the military at one point or another. There were active reservist type units in all three. The Rifleman Union in Lithuania is something called the Kaitselet, which means sort of defense league in Estonia, and the Aisargi, which is sort of a National Guard sort of thing in Latvia. And a lot of people have been there. It turns out, historically looking at the role of the scouting movement plays a role in this, because it turns out rather lots of scouts and scout leaders end up in the partisan resistance later on, and particularly Lithuania and sort of a southeastern corner of Latvia, the role of the Catholic Church plays a role here too, in that it is an ideological opponent of communism, always has been. The Kremlin and the Vatican had never liked each other, but also it had an external hierarchy outside of Lithuania, and it had it was one of the only institutions that permeated every part of the country and had its own sort of chain of command. So it played a role there too. But what I'm going to say is, originally, everybody got caught out. All right, there wasn't a lot of immediate resistance, and some of the resistance that came early on was really quite amateurish. But by sort of late 1940, 1941, what you have is an awful lot of people planning for trying to mobilize and organize for a general uprising. The idea is that they're not going to try to have a piecemeal resistance against the Soviet occupier. A lot of people quite rationally can't square in their mind the juxtaposition between fascism and Bolshevism and figure that it's going to give eventually. And that turned out to be actually quite accurate. Now, not only that, German intelligence is reaching out to some of these outfits. And I should say, this is the first aspect of German collaboration that comes up. And I'm going to talk about collaboration in depth because that's a word that cuts a lot of different ways. I should say, at this point, most of this is coordination with the Abwehr, which is the Foreign Intelligence Service of Germany, at a point where the Abwehr is actively plotting against Hitler. So there's that little twist. So the Abwehr is looking to fight its communist enemy and not trying to achieve sort of ideological goals in this part of the world. It's hoping to basically, stoke these Baltic patriots into, being a fifth column. And that actually kind of that does happen. All right. So what happens in 1941? And there's there's an important context here. In early June 1941, the Soviet Union starts its first wave of mass deportations with a general plan of trying to remove about 10% of the population. We're talking genocide here, okay? But we're talking, either imprison or deport. And the Soviet word, deportation, means actually not being thrown out of the country, means taken across the Soviet Union and plonked in the middle of nowhere in places like Siberia, Kazakhstan, the far north of European Russia, and mostly being left to fend for yourself. It's basically going to the gulag without offense. And this starts to kick off only about a week, as it turns out, before the German invasion. So the German invasion in the end of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, comes at a point to exactly interrupt this mass deportation effort. And so what happens is you get uprisings. The most organized uprising was in Lithuania. However, groups in Latvia and Estonia, which were further behind the lines, gradually started organizing and uprising too. Now, this is also an area where in 1941 the Lithuanian bit of it gets a little bit controversial because they were actually well prepared. They were ready to go. There's conspiracy theories floating that maybe even possibly the Germans told them to be ready for it because they were suspiciously well ready, because by the end of the first day, I mean, the sun hasn't even set in Kaunas, and the Lithuanians have declared a provisional government, more or less chucked the Soviets out of the town and out of the city, and had taken over the radio station and all this. It doesn't take very, because Kaunas is not very far from the German border, and this offense comes along. The Germans turn up, and the Germans basically very quickly either disband or co-opt these guys. With the exception, there are a couple SS guys who come along here and start propagandizing and proselytizing, and basically scoop up some of this 1941 uprising and put them immediately to work oppressing Jewish people. So this is a highly problematic part of the story. Whether any of that was going to happen without the SS coming along and deliberately sort of stirring the pot, hard to say. And I'm going to talk. I will talk about the Holocaust and collaboration shortly here, because it becomes an important factor in this whole thing. But what happens during Nazi occupation? Well, that's not the greatest map there. I should have done a bigger map. There was a lot of initial optimism by the Baltic people, because a lot of people figured that this was going to be like 1915. Okay. Oh, the Germans are back. Well, when the Germans turned up in the First World War, I see you got your cat there. Hello, cat.
Yeah, Charlie's joining me. He's co-hosting.
Okay. Yeah. So in the First World War, German occupation was viewed by many people as largely a good thing. They chucked the Tsar out. The Germans didn't have, the Kaiser-era Germany didn't engage in a lot of oppression in these areas, kind of let them get on with their own things. So it was a period of self-government in a lot of ways. So Baltic independence owes a lot to a relatively lax German occupation. And so what you get is some people were thinking, well, the Germans are back. Maybe it'll be like 1915. So you can see why people thought that way. Those hopes were dashed. This whole area, the three Baltic countries and Belarus, were kludged together in this thing called Ostland. It was more like the general government in Poland. It wasn't like Vichy France or anything like that. There wasn't really a national level, ethnically Baltic administrations. There were sort of middle level, lower level governments were kept going, but they were under puppet administrators. But this was designed to be a German colony for extraction of resources. There's collaboration. I'm going to talk about collaboration a whole separate side, because there's collaboration both ways, because being stuck between these two large powers, people collaborate, cooperate, get co-opted or get conscripted by either side, and because desertion is rife, there's a lot of backwards and forwards going. I got a whole slide coming up on the Holocaust. I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to throw in a couple other things that were going on during the Second World War, during this Nazi occupation. A rise of Jewish partisan units, particularly in Lithuania and one spot in Latvia, not in Estonia. It's only because the Estonian Jewish population was actually quite minuscule. But there's a whole story to be had, and I do talk about that a fair bit in my book about Jewish partisans. There was also what we call the Soviet or Red partisans. These were elements of the Red Army largely that had been sort of trapped behind the German lines, coalescing into guerrilla units. They were more of a factor in Belarus and Ukraine and Russia proper than they were in the Baltic states. But it'd be a total lie to ignore them in the Baltic states. Soviet era historiography makes them out to be more than they really are, because they had very poor relations with the locals. One of the key things going on in this particular time is that the Lithuanians managed to boycott formation of an SS legion. Okay, and that goes on, and while this is all going on, resistance groups are starting to formulate themselves. Okay, and again, after that initial shock of 1941 uprisings, a lot of those guys died in the uprisings. Some fled. Some got co-opted into sort of German police units and things like that, but most of them faded back into the woodwork. In 1942, you could think that this war was going to go either way. By 1943, most people in the Baltic states were pretty sure that this German thing wasn't going to last, and that the Soviets were going to come back, and that the Soviets were the enemy worth holding out for, if you will. So it was a matter of enduring the Germans and then maybe possibly, fighting the Soviets when they come back. So there was an awful lot of that going on. There's an awful lot of opportunistic enlistment, where guys would join German units to get arms, ammunition, clothing, food, and then desert again. There's a record of a guy in Latvia who had more or less the Latvian equivalent name of John Smith, who seemed to have enlisted 11 or 12 times, each making off with 2 hand grenades and a rifle. So, I mean, yeah, I got to give him some credit. And I guess part of that raises the issue, was this a three-way conflict? In reality, it kind of is. The Baltic states want their countries back, and they're stuck between two enemies that were at one point, in 1939, really, when the whole thing started, they were the same enemy. It's just that one of the enemies switched the goalposts a bit. So from a Baltic perspective, it's not like all of a sudden the Soviet Union is this great friend and ally, because it isn't. Now, on top of this, the Nazis have this ethnic vision of Eastern Europe that tolerates Baltic people but does not tolerate the existence of Jewish and Romani people. And so you get this absolute massacre of the Jewish population. And there's some of the statistics on there. If you add up how many Jews were killed in the Baltics, physically killed in the Baltic states, you get actually higher totals than these. And that's because actually Jews from Poland and other places were brought in to work in various labor camps on various projects in the Baltic states, where they ended up dying, particularly in Estonia. Lots of Jews died in Estonia because of oil shale mining. But what you see is an absolute destruction of Jewish culture and Jewish civilization, particularly in Lithuania, where it had been for a very, very long period of time. Vilna, whatever you want to call it, it has about 9 names, had been a very, very, had been an epicenter of Jewish learning and culture for 500 years. I should say that, sadly, the massacre of Romani people was even more harshly effective than that of Judaism. Totally eradicated the Roma people in the region. There was a lot of collaboration by locals, partly because actually the Soviet experience had been bad, and Nazi propaganda tried to conflate Judaism with Soviet Bolshevism. That was one thing. There are historic currents of anti-Semitism that had run through those countries as well. So there was in some senses, for some people, pushing on an open door. And another thing I'd say is nearly all of this had been, this eradication happened quite quickly on. It was Einstein's group and stuff. It's not that not a lot of Lithuanians got dragged off to Auschwitz. I mean, a lot of this was just killed in place, and it's pretty gory and brutal and bad. And there's no skinning the cat in a way such that, your cat's looking at me now, such that some of these people who were participants in this ended up later on in resistance movements. There's no getting away from that. Less than some people would have you believe, but I can't deny it. But again, because this is a complicated area, there's a prevailing countercurrent as well, too, which is rather a lot of people helped Jews escape. And so, you know, in Latvia, a lot of Jews were smuggled over to Sweden, over the water. In Latvia, in Lithuania, 924 people are entered in the role of the righteous among nations in Yad Vashem. And the number is only 3 in Estonia, but one of them stands out in particular, a language professor who saved, more or less single-handedly saved Estonian Judaism. And I'd also have to say the other thing that ironically saved Jewish culture in the Baltic states was actually the Soviet secret police, because those deportations and arrests in 1940 and 1941 had collared a bunch of Jewish people and taken them to the Gulag, and where they ended up largely, but not all, surviving. So in a weird way, the Gulag worked as a lifeboat for Baltic Judaism.
Wow.
Let's move on. So there's this whole idea of collaboration, or is it cooperation, or is it coercion, or is it co-option? So I had to come up with this spectrum. So on one hand, the guy who enlists, but then immediately runs off with the two hand grenades and a bullet, and 40 bullets and a rifle. He's not a collaborator, even if his name is in the SS Legion's enlistment books. Okay, so there's that. There's an awful lot of people who were collared and dragged away for slave labor, particularly in Lithuania, because of SS Legion recruitment basically failed there. But what didn't fail was dragging guys off the streets and taking them to work in factories under slave labor conditions in places like Bohemia and Germany proper and Western Poland and Silesia. There in the middle of the spectrum, you got people who are conscripted, or enlistment, but enlistment was harsh choices. Like enlist, some people were clearly given sign up or prison labor, one or the other, or sign up, or if you sign up, we're not going to lock your family up. So enlistment due to theoretically voluntary enlistment. You've got voluntary enlistment due to propaganda, because I think we infantilized the Nazis into cartoon baddies, but they were actually very, very good at propaganda. And so particularly when they come in fast on the heels of an oppressive occupier, it's, again, pushing on the open door to recruit some people to go off and kill more Soviets. Some people are voluntary enlistment due to opportunism, because that's the thing to go. This is the way the wind is blowing. Gee, these Germans look like they're going to win. I want to be on the winning side. There are people like that in every war in every country.
Yep.
Okay. And then you've got the weirdos, and there's a reason why I put them on the far right on this column, because there were, the people who were in the small, fascist or sort of fascist adjacent right-wing groups. They were easy voluntary enlistments, and they tended to do well in that regime, in that they were sergeants and lieutenants, not just cannon fodder. I would also say, spin this around, the same spectrum works with collaboration, cooperation with the Soviet occupier. Yeah. Okay. Is there a difference between slave labor in a munition factory in Breslau versus Magnitogorsk? All right. So, and a lot of people were conscripted by the Red Army on the way out the door and dragged away that way. So what you get is, a roughly equal amount of people fought on both sides. Both of those two sides, the Soviet side and the Nazi side, from the Baltic countries. And again, there is this factor of desertion. There's a lot of desertion going either way on this too. All right. Yeah. So, and there are people that fought on both sides and they fought on none, and it gets messy very, very quickly.
And I'm glad you put that chart up, because it's been a recurring theme on the channel, is that the words of resistance and collaboration are too loaded. They're too binary. They don't allow enough nuance in France, let alone the Baltic states. I mean, because there's so many variations between those two terms.
Yeah, and I'm going to give another axis to the chart, and maybe someday I'm going to write a combined theory on this. There's the other axis of the chart, is that what did people do What did they or their unit actually do? And there's a range there from really bad stuff. It ranges from shooting Jewish and Romani people in the head, all the way down to air raid protection and fire brigade duty, and everything in between. And so you have to put that previous axis again, and so you do get the sort of you combine these two axes, you get a quadrant of 10% of this collaboration, cooperation, coercion, or 20% even, depending on where you go, is really problematic, and another 20% that probably isn't problematic at all because, and then what do you do with this squishy bit in the middle? Because, there are a lot of people who basically their wartime service there was fighting against the Soviets. The Soviets had done bad things to them. Do you really feel bad about that? A lot of people were corralled up into self-defense units at the very last moment, which were then sort of left behind as the Germans fled. These not really collaborators. They're proto-resistance cells, digging ditches, guarding railway lines. Yeah, you're helping the German war effort, but that's not the same as locking up your neighbors and putting them behind barbed wire. So, all this stuff happened. And so if you have partisan X, some guy turns up and you find out your uncle Einar's was in the Latvian resistance, but he'd also cooperated with the Germans. You gotta drill down a bit and just look at, all right, why did he join? What did he do? Okay, and you got to take these things on an individual basis. And this is a point where it's easy for us in places like the U.S. and the U.K. surrounded with nice fat water frontiers and a nice binary way of thinking about it. A lot of people had no good choices to make. They had a buffet of bad choices, and not making a choice was also one of those buffet of bad choices because a choice was going to get foisted on you. Okay,
yeah.
so. Yeah, it's a messy period of time. But where does this leave us?
Just a quick question from Sean. Yeah. Back to your chart from Sean Brennan. Does the opportunity? I'll start that again. Does the opportunistic ideology spectrum work for resistance groups not aligned to the Nazis or the USSR? These small holding farms you're talking about, where they're sort of more thinking about survival of their community.
Yeah. I think. All right. I think I'm going to answer that in passing on here. If I haven't answered that properly, rope me back into that, because we're going to talk about really. So when the Soviets come back, the Forrest brothers come into their own. The general rise of the sort of golden age of resistance against the Soviet Union comes largely from stay behind units and these territorial self-defense units that were very hastily roped together and armed by the Germans and left. As a general rule, the proper Nazis, the guys who really were the ideological fascists, they knew that they were going to end up at the end of a rope or in a gulag or in a firing squad. They ended up largely buggering off to the west with the Nazis. Some got trapped in Latvia, but they ended up mostly buggering off. So what you get is you get resistance that starts conventional and gets very quickly overwhelmed. Okay. And quickly has to transition from, battalions trying to actually fight the Russians that are coming and quickly realizing that they're outnumbered 20-1, and fragmenting into small platoon size and company size units, but then also quickly realizing that that's too big for partisan resistance because it's hard to keep you fed and it's hard to hide. You can hide 10 guys in a small farm in a forest. You can't hide 100. And the Soviets have air cover, so they can see stuff. So what you get is also an interesting golden era, this brief period of time in Latvia and Estonia in the summer of 1944, where some people, because the collapse of the front kind of catches the Soviets by surprise. So there's a withdrawal by the Germans in a lot of areas, and the Soviets aren't ready to advance. So there's this hiatus where a bit of self-government can come back in, and more importantly, lots of people can flee to the west. Okay, not so much in Lithuania, but particularly in Estonia, lots of people flee over the water to Estonia, to Finland and Sweden. And there's also basically an escape service being run by the by Latvian partisans out to Sweden as well. It's not really in my book, but there is also a more traditional urban resistance that is not really an armed resistance. The urban resistance is largely a nonviolent thing. It's underground publishing, smuggling people out, getting fake documents, things like that. It's a more classic dissident type resistance movement, often in liaison with the people out in the forests. And there are people who sort of transition between the two, not as many as you would think, but there are some people who sort of floated in both worlds. And so we get to this golden era of post-war insurgency. And it was actually big and lasted a lot longer than most people want to give it credit for. In Estonia, you're looking at about 14 to 15,000 partisan fighters. These are approximate figures, hard to say. It's not like there was a census. But this also represents approximately 1% of the population. Okay, Estonia is not a big country, and what you get was you had sort of, again, the peak was quite early on in 1947. Estonia never quite managed to form a national movement until it was a little bit late. By the time they formed their national movement, the RVL, they were down to sort of 1,000 hardcore fighters and some associate fighters. Latvia was a very fragmented situation for several reasons. First of all, the nascent sort of national structure in Latvia actually got locked up by the Germans before the end of the war, leaving them on the back foot. Also, the progression of the Soviets across Latvia was actually fairly slow. The far eastern bits of Latvia were liberated in August of 1944. The west of Latvia, the Courland Peninsula, was still in German hands at the time of the surrender in May 1945. Lithuania, again. So there were a lot of different units in Latvia. No true national movement emerged, despite the fact that they all seem to have national in the title. It got, tracking the Latvian partisans, it gets very, forgive the pun, it's People's Front of Judea very, very quickly. Okay. And I think their movement suffered for it greatly. Lithuania managed a succession of 3 different national movements and peaked at about 30,000 guerrilla fighters. And that peak was in sort of 1948, 1949. And, the Lithuanians managed de facto nighttime control of large swaths of the countryside, and some of it even during the day, until 1948, 1949. And I'm going to explain why that's the case in a bit here. And they had 3 increasingly centralized national movements. They sort of burned through 2 of them because of infiltration by Soviet agents, but the third one was pretty good and had, branches and cell structures from the national command structure all the way down to every single district of Lithuania. And these groups basically lasted until the mid-1950s. They got smaller and smaller and smaller. And I'm going to talk about tactics here. I'm cognizant of the time. I don't want to burn my time too much. Several things here. It would be a mistake to refer to this as a high intensity or even medium intensity conflict. These partisan units were poorly equipped, didn't have a lot of arms and ammunition, had almost no explosives. So there wasn't a lot of sort of sabotage with explosive sort of stuff. A lot of that had to do with, there wasn't really a mining industry in Lithuania and Latvia. There was a little bit in Estonia. So what you get is a low intensity conflict where small partisan units, the average partisan unit is 5, 10, maybe 15 people. Okay, because larger than that, it's hard to hide, it's hard to feed it. And they viewed basically surviving and maintaining control of the countryside as the objective, not going out and actually having a lot of fights. Okay, they would fight if cornered, but wanted to save their ammunition. And so a lot of what they were trying to do, they lived in, I'm going to get lots of underground bunkers. There are underground bunkers from the top to the bottom of the Baltic states, some of them quite elaborate, many of them probably still undiscovered, probably full of dead bodies of partisans to this day. If you find an underground bunker, be very careful. Some of that old ordnance is probably very dangerous. I say that as a public announcement. Underground bunkers became extremely important because these dugouts allowed them to stay warm in the winter. The Baltic winter is ferociously bad, but also it allowed them to hide. Some of the forests are broadleaf, so they lose the leaves in the winter. So again, the enemy has aircraft. So hiding from overhead cover is extremely important. That's one of the things they learned early on, was that the Soviets would find them from the air. And a big thing is to oppose sham elections. A lot of the activity that they did do was to resist the various elections to Supreme Soviets that the Soviets were trying to do. The Soviets were trying to get their typical 120% sort of voter turnout. And I'm not kidding. Some of these districts reported 117% voter turnout for their one candidate. And so the partisan units, I think they wasted a lot of time on that. That's my thing. They wasted ammunition and they wasted effort, and a lot of guys died opposing elections that I don't think anybody in the rest of the world thought were legitimate anyway. But there was an awful lot of that going on. There's an awful lot of sabotaging ballot boxes and making it difficult for people to vote. A big thing is resisting collectivization of agriculture. All right, because it's the small farms that can keep them fed. And if these farms get collectivized, and collectivization of agriculture is a road to starvation for the country, as we learned in the Ukrainian famine in the 1930s, and it's expropriation and destitution for these farmers, and these are largely agrarian economies. So a lot of this is basically trying to prevent the Soviets from collectivizing the rural economy. And there's some success for some years in that. There are raids for resources. There are jailbreaks. There are truly heroic sort of, and it's interesting what some of these raids for resources were for. Paper and ink, blank Soviet passports. These were key things that they wanted to raid for. There were jailbreaks. Let's go liberate our comrades out of the prison. Let's hijack the KGB convoy and let the guys out. The partisans also basically served to really deny labor to the Soviet army and the Soviet industry by making it difficult for the Soviets to conscript in the rural areas and to drag people off to industrial jobs. A huge thing is waiting for World War III. Okay, because they all figured, well, we kind of called that Soviet. We all figured that Soviet Nazi thing was going to bust up. And something's going to give, and it did. They all rather reckoned that the Soviet Union and the Western Allies were going to have World War III and go at it, in which case that's the time for the uprising, so we can declare provisional governments, we can be a fifth column for the Americans and the British, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, that never happened.
Right.
And a huge part of this is underground press, particularly in Lithuania, not to be sniffed at in Latvia, less so in Estonia for reasons I'm not even sure I can fathom. I mean, some of it had to do with the fact that because of the Catholic Church hierarchy, there were lots of rotary printers out in parish halls all over rural Lithuania. Every parish church was cranking out newsletters. And clever priests, one of the first things they did was go take that rotary printer and bury it in a pigsty somewhere. Okay, so there's a lot of underground press going on, and printing and distributing. And some of these things had print runs into the thousands. Okay, others were quite, shall we say, boutique publications, individually typed out on typewriters. But there was a lot of that going on. All right, we've seen the bunker. There is some interaction with the West. And I see some comments have already sort of hit on this. And by the West, I'm going to lump Sweden and Finland on this too. Sweden and Finland are trying to conduct liaison with these groups. Finland feels bad about this whole situation. Lots of Estonians had come over to help Finland during its winter war. And some Estonians served with the Finnish army in the Second World War. So early parts of the Estonian resistance, a lot of it are these guys who were actually trained up in Finland and smuggled back over in 1944. Sweden is interested in what's going on over the water because Sweden, really dodged a bullet in the Second World War, is really worried about World War III. But this interaction with the West isn't about stoking an insurgency. The insurgency is already stoked. This is not even about arming the insurgency. This is about liaison for collection of intelligence, and that's a key difference, all right? Because all the Western intelligence services and Sweden, ostensibly neutral, are viewing these guerrilla groups as sources of information, because a mobilization and plans for invading the West are going to be visible to people, behind the Iron Curtain. So they view these guys as lots of eyes and ears. MI6 ran this thing called Operation Jungle. There's a reason why John Harvey Jones is on there. You might remember him from Troubleshooter. Well, he got his MBE as a naval intelligence officer running something called the British Baltic Fisheries Protection Service, which was actually covered to run converted E-boats with better engines to smuggle people into mostly Latvia and Estonia, because there was more coastline. The U.S. CIA came involved on this too. Their operation was mostly airborne and dropping people mostly into Lithuania. So there's a little bit of a division of effort. These were heavily failed efforts, I should say, largely because of Soviet infiltration of MI6. A guy named Kim Philby wasn't involved in this Baltic stuff, but he was very adjacent to it. He was involved in similar efforts in the Caucasus and in Albania, so knew this stuff was going on and managed to feed a lot of information back to his Soviet handlers. So a lot of agents smuggled in for liaison went to their doom. One that didn't is Josas Luksha, national hero in Lithuania, the guy in the middle. He was a partisan leader, managed to get out, establish contact with the West, and got parachuted back in, resulting in the biggest manhunt in Soviet history. And he stayed on the run, leading partisans well into the early 50s, and died a bad end. Everybody dies a bad end of this story, basically. And I'd say, there's a strain of Soviet historiography that tries to point the Baltic partisans as some sort of Western intelligence operation. No, and it's actually quite a failure of the Western intelligence services. And some of the documents that have come out, there's a lot of declassified CIA documents. They're hilariously bad. I could write a whole new book on that at some point. Okay, looking at the time here. How am I doing on time? Can I keep going on this, Paul?
Yep, got another 15, 20 minutes or so. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, because I do want to answer some questions. The Soviet order of battle, the primary combatants were depending on the day of what year we're talking about, it was the NKVD, which became the NGB, which became the KGB. They're internal troops, which are basically an internal army. The conventional Red Army was more of a backstop. Was not used for a lot of counterpartisan stuff except in a real pinch, because honestly, the Soviet authorities didn't trust their own conscripts. A lot of these conscripts were guys just like the people they're fighting. And, a conscript from Kazakhstan might look at one of these forest brothers and say, yeah, I'm with these guys. The NKVD troops were more ideologically motivated, more ideologically controlled. And so not just the internal troops, there were also secret police and domestic intelligence, which is quite effective. The NKVD developed basically treated it like an intelligence operation, populated the countryside with case officers who recruited informants. And there are because these countries have external frontiers, either nautical or land frontiers. The border troops play a huge role in this, and trying to keep people in, keep people out. Red Army plays a role in this, as does conventional policing. And that's where you start getting into collaborationism too. And there's a funny word in the middle there, Istrebiteli. The Istrebiteli that's a word kind of meaning vaguely in Russian meaning destroyer. These were collaborationist goon squads, basically. They were the misfits of society. A lot of them were literally conventional criminals. Some were drug addicts and things like that. Some were deserters from the German army, in fact, things like that. They were rounded up and given a choice. You guys can go to the Gulag, or you can be our brute squad. And they were used for a lot of sort of dirty work that the regime could sort of distance itself from. Oh, I'm sorry, our auxiliaries got a little out of control that time. The Red Army doesn't rape and pillage. Sorry about the raping and pillaging. And there was an awful lot of that going on with these Istrebiteli, particularly in 1946, 1947. And this is a case of rather a lot of them were ethnically Baltic. All right, so this is this is again, you get into the brother versus brother. This is a form of collaborationism. Okay, and so it figures heavily in the accounts there. They were the ones most heavily hated by the by the partisans. Partisans tried to not attack the Red Army. They viewed the Red Army largely as fellow victims, largely conscripts. Yeah. The Easter Beatley were really, you wouldn't want to be one of these guys caught out after dark if one of these Force brothers had a single bullet left. The eventual Soviet victory ground down through attrition. Partisan movements without formal external support don't last very long. They managed to last for years, and that's a miracle in itself. The only real replacement for lost, dead or captured or sick partisans is younger people getting old enough to come and fight. Okay, and that does happen. But the replacement timeline and the replacement pipeline gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's a point where if by 1948, 1949, a partisan unit, if it loses 3 of its guys, it might only be able to replace 1 of them. Again, the typical oppression tactics, arrest, torture, infiltration, betrayal, these all did work. Conscription and deportation reduced the recruit pool. A ethnic Lithuanian dragged off the streets of Kaunas and sent off to be a Soviet border guard on the Chinese border is just physically not available for the resistance movement. The gradual omnipresence of the Soviet state bureaucracy made it harder and harder to live off the grid. It was quite easy to live off the grid on an old ID card in 1946. By 1951, 52, it was impossible. Border patrols, again, very large garrisoning. There are cases in rural districts of Lithuania where it took something like as much as a 30-to-1 ratio of Soviet security forces to partisans to secure control of the environment. And again, this is a situation where the Soviet Union can afford that kind of force structure ratio in a way that something like the US and Vietnam or the French and Algeria never could have. Both conventional and unconventional combat tactics worked. So there were sweeps. They literally occasionally have these sweeps through areas where they would, basically go through the whole forest at a double arm interval with rifles and bayonets and hope to find the bunker. There were fake partisan units sent in to impersonate partisans and try to entice people in or to infiltrate gangs. Amnesties. I should say amnesties, we laugh about a KGB amnesty, but the KGB basically honored its amnesties because they valued it as a useful counterinsurgency tool. There are instances of KGB officers being disciplined by Moscow for going back and reneging on amnesties and things like that. So amnesties allowed a way out of the partisan unit, and it was exploited. It was exploited by the partisans as well. The partisan units gradually started to view these amnesties as ways to offload the sick and the tired, and to get people back out of the program who were just going to hold them back. And a lot of them had, for example, Lithuanians developed a compartmentation process where somebody who was going to go amnesty would spend 30 days, in isolation away from the partisan unit before turning himself. And so he didn't have any more current information to give out. He only had old information. The death of Stalin took a lot of the heat out of this. Stalin died in the early 1950s. Some of the more harsher Sovietization plans of the Baltic states didn't come to fruition. And most importantly, the gradual collectivization of agriculture choked off the food supply. Also going to say, lots of partisans and people who were partisan adjacent ended up in the Gulag. There's a whole series of Gulag uprisings. So you can make an argument. I make that argument quite, I think, convincingly in my book, that a whole front of the Baltic resistance movement happened in the mid-1950s in 3 different mass uprisings in the Gulag system after the death of Stalin. And Lithuanians, as well as Latvians and Estonians, and I should say Poles and Ukrainians too, and some unrepatriated German POWs all played a role in these Gulag uprisings. I think we could probably, I mean, whether it's really within the remit of WW2 TV or not, I think we could probably do a whole Gulag uprising show. Save that for another day. And somebody's going to ask, before I stop and take questions, did it matter? Okay, and this is going to answer some of these questions I've seen streaming in the comments here. One of the things is it delayed collectivization of agriculture in economies that were actually quite agrarian economies to begin with. And what this did was this had whole years in which case it was impossible for the Soviets to import a lot of labor. I mean, particularly in Lithuania, less so in Latvia and Estonia, because they were more urbanized and more industrialized. So what this did was actually one of the reasons why Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia managed to stay ethnically homogeneous to the point that they are today has in part to do with these delays in the collectivization of agriculture. Okay?
Right.
All right. And so it delayed the change of demographics. It's starkest in Lithuania and less stark in the other two. In Latvia and Estonia, particularly that period in 1944, it bought time for people to flee. And this emigre presence in the West, where there had not been a strong Lithuania had a big diaspora in the U.S. from the 1860s onward. That's where my people come from. Right. There was not a large Latvian or Estonian diaspora, but they became one as a result of this period of time in 1944. So these people were a lifeboat for Latvian and Estonian culture and religion and language. During key points of the Cold War, early Cold War, these partisan movements tied down a lot of resources. Certainly some lives were saved by this whole effort. Some were lost, I'd say. I mean, by preventing some deportation and arrests, and by honestly assassinating some of the more outrageous Soviet secret policemen, I think some particularly bad things some atrocities were probably averted. The manpower available, this whole thing, not only did it tie up several divisions of Soviet troops, it probably at various points denied the Soviet Union the equivalent of about two other divisions worth of conscripts. Again, delayed some of the harshest Russification efforts. I mean, there were some of the efforts that were mooted were really quite harsh. They were going to basically ban the languages. They were going to ban printing in the Latin alphabet. As I said, this exported dissent and combat expertise into the Gulag system where it kicked off. And I think also, just as importantly, these were valuable and important and powerful symbols for these countries. And they are to this day now. And so in each one of these countries, the people who are the famous partisans are household names. All right. So there is a legacy, and it's a mixed legacy because you get to the whole Holocaust thing and people still don't know how to process this.
Yeah.
And there are a couple really, I've not really named any names hardly in this thing. I named some really bad names in my book. I point some fingers where I can. But I'd also say, I do that on purpose because not everybody was a bad person. I felt incumbent that I should, point it out where I found it. Now, on that note, I really want to take some questions. Take about 10 minutes of questions here.
Yeah, well, firstly, just thank you very much, Dan. I mean, you took us through a really, really complicated, multi-war, multi-era, multinational, multi-ideology set of circumstances and explained it very, very well. So thank you for that. So I've saved a few from the chat early on. So James Murphy's asking, this is about the bunker setup. I hope we touch on outdoor forest survival skills, ersatz pioneer, bunker complexes, stolen German weapons, and general woodland foraging. So is that kind of how it worked?
Well, yeah. This is one of the reasons why, for example, people who had military expertise and people from the scouting movement, including women, I should add, people had sort of woodcraft experience. A partisan group didn't need to have everybody with that. It just needed somebody who knew something about that. There was a fair bit of that. There were a lot of the weaponry. The weaponry started out as old as a mix of stuff from the pre-war era, and German weaponry. Mostly as they ran out of ammunition, they ended up migrating to Soviet weaponry. The German ammunition by the end of the war was rusting and corroding quite badly. and didn't have a really good shelf life in a damp forest. So there is that. What's the next question here?
Well, connected to that one about that, Sean Byrne is saying, it sounds like the Forest Brothers were typically full-time participants. Did no resistance groups live normally with day jobs, etc., but do resistance work after hours, or is that urban resistance?
It's a spectrum. The classic Forest Brother was a full-time person, and mostly because he was on the run. Okay, a lot of these guys end up joining the movement because they're hiding from the Soviet authorities, so they can't hold a day job, or they're dodging conscription, which is a huge one because the Soviets are running around trying to basically color all the military-age males, particularly early on. But then, if you're a military-age male, and you're 25, one of the first things is, all right, where's your service record? So. Yeah, where you get really interesting people living the dual life is in Latvian, it's rather patronizing, called the Forest Daughters. I think we should call them the Forest Sisters. Lots of women involved, and the women often had a dual existence because very often the women would be the liaison between the partisan world and the world on the outside, taking information and documents and stuff from one to the other. Also being liaison between different partisan groups because women weren't subject to being conscripted. So and this is a society where actually, because of a world war and a lot of people in prison camps anyway, rural society is more heavily female than male at this point. So 3 women walking down the road pushing a wheelbarrow is not a problem. 3 guys pushing a wheelbarrow is going to be seen from air, and get somebody ready to go investigate it.
Okay, thanks. So going back to this, about the early part from Rob Crane here, Dan said these countries were to some extent single-party, single-person rule. What happened after Soviet occupation? Were they incorporated into the new political structure? So we're going back pre-Nazis.
Okay, back to 1940. Basically, what happened is the Soviets ran rigged elections for something called people's governments, and basically tried to run it so there was only one candidate per constituency. Okay, there are a few places had a few extra candidates on, but then it was rigged. So you got these token parliaments, these people's parliaments. It's still technically independent countries, but these people's assemblies meet, and the only thing that they do when they meet is they vote themselves out of existence and demand incorporation in the Soviet Union. So those old governments go away, and they become the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. Yeah. And this is also at the point where there's actually running around somewhere. There's also a bit of a rump Finnish Soviet Socialist Republic too.
Right. Okay. So 3 or 4 more. So this is another one from Rob Crane. So presumably there were nationalist independence movements during the Khrushchev and Gorbachev eras. Could any of them trace lineage all the way back to pre-war governance?
Yeah. Yes and no. No. What you did have is, because you had a lot of people in exile. And so you had a lot of you had these various, even though there were one-party states, it doesn't mean there weren't other political parties. There were a lot of political parties that were basically suppressed: Christian Democrats, socialists, social democrats, everything from just left of communism to just right of fascism had a political party, and these political parties all existed in the West amongst the immigration, and some of them really tried to come back to life in the Gorbachev era. And so, but there's a whole different history of that. The partisan movements died out, and they got replaced by frankly a different independence movement that starts to come up really only in the 70s. Okay. And that's an urban and it's an intellectual movement, not a rural movement. And that's a different history. So we can sort of talk about that some other day.
Yeah, I think this is raising some several potential subjects for a future show. But three more questions. Jeff is asking, did the Lithuanian immigrants to Chicago and upper Midwest, like the Polish, did they go to particular areas in the US?
Oh, yeah. I mean, my people went to Connecticut, but it really depends on what time you left. Lithuania. In 1918, when Lithuania got its independence back, the biggest Lithuanian city in the world was Chicago. Okay.
Right.
there are a lot of Lithuanian immigrants from the 1860s to 1880s tend to end up in Chicago, lots of meatpacking jobs, but also people ended up in northeastern Pennsylvania in the coal mines, particularly if you emigrated in the 1890s. My people ended up in Connecticut because there were a lot of industrial jobs on the go. My people left in about 1910. So it depends. There's a whole fascinating history on that.
Right. I think this is the last one. I think it's probably the best one to leave with from Peter O'Connell, because you talked about the motivations and ideology, particularly in the kind of the Nazi era and the early Soviet. But by the time it gets to the kind of 1950s and the Soviets kind of appear to stay, Peter is saying, was there any degree of consensus unification amongst the groups that survived the end of the war in facing the Soviet counterforce? So they've been fighting maybe for different reasons, but did they kind of unite again at that point?
Well, yeah. I'll say this. What constituted the partisan groups by about 1948, 1949 had been through a lot of attrition and through the ringer a lot, and didn't much resemble what had existed in 1944.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like comparing a football club 10 years on.
Yeah. And for example, there was this big in the 1941 uprising in Lithuania. I mean, demographically, it's hard to link that to say 1950 because of age. Somebody who was 20 in 1950, was 11 in 1941. Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, you could do a big chart with lots of dotted lines, and you'll drive yourself insane on this. I mean, more importantly, I guess the way to look at it is you could look at certain individuals and follow their journey through this. That would be an interesting story too. And some people went around the houses on these things.
Well, we'll leave it there, Dan. I mean, it's been engrossing. I haven't actually bought a copy of the book yet, but you've made me want to go out and get it. Hold up a copy there. The link is in the description below, folks. So I suggest you go out there and, because I mean, you've obviously given us a kind of the Cliff Notes version in an hour today. There's a lot more in the book. So I can't wait to find the invitation to bring you back again. All
right. I'll come back and we'll talk Gulag uprisings, because nobody knows anything about that.
We'll do that. So, folks, thanks for watching. This is Paul Dead for World War II TV saying I'll see you all next time. Cheers, everybody. Bye.